Y'all ready to spend the next, 3 hours on a walking tour? A 3-hour tour? A 3-hour tour? Okay, well, glad to see so many of y'all here on such a, what's going to be a pleasant day. It's supposed to go up into the low 50s. Well, we didn't get any snow. My wife, Nancy, was disappointed that we didn't get any snow. She lives for snow. She doesn't live for me, she lives for snow. But I guess the best thing to do, let's just walk around down here so we can all sort of gather together in a closer view. Now, no stragglers in this group. This is foot cavalry this morning. We're going to have to all keep up. One of my former students is recording all of this, so I have to watch my language. You know, I wonder sometimes if our founding fathers would even recognize what America has become. No. Well, that answers that. Like Ronald Reagan said in his inaugural address, you know, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. And that's the way so many Americans saw government in those days. Now, let's qualify this, because about 1/3 of Americans were loyalists. They were still loyal to the British government. But an increasing number of Americans wanted to be independent, but not until 1776. You keep in mind that for a decade, Americans wanted to work out solutions with the British government. They considered themselves British. They'd been a part of the British Empire since they landed on American shores in the 17th century. But the thinking was in Great Britain, let the colonies develop on their own. And that whatever economic institutions develop, that'll be beneficial for Great Britain. Remember the mercantile system from your studies in school. So let them develop on their own. But what the government in Great Britain did not anticipate was not only was the economic system sort of tied to the larger imperial system, which was the massive empire worldwide. You know, the old saying that you could sail from sun up to sundown and not leave the British Empire. So the American colonies were just part of that big imperial system. But what the government did not anticipate was that the Americans would develop independent, distinctive political institutions. So from the very beginning at Jamestown, they elected representatives to represent all of the communities up and down the James River. Whereas in Great Britain, remember that all members of Parliament represented all members of the empire. So there were no Americans who were members of Parliament. Members of Parliament learned about American affairs from guys like Benjamin Franklin, who was a diplomat. But the diplomats, like Franklin, didn't tell the British government any more than they thought the British government needed to hear so that they would not interfere in American affairs. So the point is that for 150 years, distinctive political, economic, and social institutions developed in America that ran counter to what the British government hoped would happen. And then after the French and Indian War ended in 1763, where the British emerged triumphant, but very much in debt. We're $24 trillion in debt. How are we ever going to pay that down? The British government was heavily in debt, but they'd gotten a lot of land from France as a result of the French and Indian War, or what was called the 7 Years' War worldwide. It was a world war. So, to raise money to pay down the war debt, to raise money to manage the greatly expanded empire, as you know, the British government started passing fees. It's a death knell of a politician to say that you're going to raise your taxes. Remember Walter Mondale, I'll be honest with you, I'm going to raise your taxes. That was the end of his political campaign. So there are fees. And of course, starting with the Sugar Act in 1764, the Quartering Act, which required Americans to quarter British soldiers that would now be permanently located in America for homeland security. And the biggest one, of course, was the Stamp Act that required all Americans to pay a fee on all printed documents, whether it was a deck of cards or a book or a pamphlet or a newspaper, a writ, a license, a will, whatever it was. And that really was sort of the beginning of the end. And as you know, there were stamp protests all over the colonies, and the first mass armed resistance to the Stamp Act occurred right here in the Lower Cape Fear at Brunswick Town in February of 1766, where there were about 500 gentlemen. Ladies never would have participated in political affairs like this, although at home they would have encouraged their husbands to do what they thought was the right thing. So at Brunswick Town in 1766, there were 500 plus armed men who confronted the royal governor about the Stamp Act. And things just got worse and worse from there, so that slowly the government started to lose control in all of the colonies, including North Carolina. And by the summer of 1775, the war had already started with Lexington and Concord in April. Our last royal governor, Josiah Martin, fled from Newbern because the Whigs, we call them Patriots, but the Loyalists called themselves Patriots too. So the American Whigs, the American Patriots, slowly took over control of the North Carolina government, as they were doing in all the other colonies too. But think of the audacity that these people had to do what they did. There were 8 million people, British members of the British Empire, but that excluded the Americans. There were about 2.5 million Americans in the 13 colonies. Now that's about, what, 1/3 the amount of North Carolinians today. So sparsely populated, and of those, about 500,000 were enslaved people. So really the only ones with power would have been about 2 million white people. And imagine the circumstances that would provoke them to take up arms and fight a revolution against the greatest empire in the world that had the finest army, they had the finest navy. This was the superpower of the world at the time. And you've got 13 ragtag colonies that are willing to risk everything. As Benjamin Franklin said, we're either going to hang individually, we're going to hang together. But either way, if we lose this thing, we're going to hang. And then to pull it off as they did. If y'all have not been watching the History Channel drama Washington, watch that, and that'll speak to a lot of the issues that I'm talking about. Although George Washington looks more like Ichabod Crane than he does George Washington. Have you noticed that? But anyway. All right, so what happened here was just kind of a culmination of the deterioration of political and economic circumstances. You know, keep in mind that Americans wanted to resolve their differences economically until 1776. But now that shots have fired, now that the British government is shooting on their own people, the stakes have changed. And within about a year, the human cost and the financial cost changed all of the stakes. So Moore's Creek was the first battle in North Carolina. 2 smaller actions had taken place in South Carolina, 96, in Virginia, Great Bridge, but this was the first battle in North Carolina. It happened on February 27, 1776, and the impact of this battle really was a shot heard around the world, as we'll talk about. Okay, so what we're going to do is just kind of walk through the battlefield and stop periodically and talk about things. And please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments, observations, hallucinations, whatever you got. Okay? All right. Anybody have any questions so far? I've answered everything. Battle of Wilmington. Yeah, I was just talking with Bert Buckley about that last week. Were you really? Yeah, he was down here talking. Yeah. Richard Caswell could have used us in 1776. Just come on out, just scrunch down, and you Southerners know what I mean when I say scrunch on in. That's not a Green Bay word.
No, sir.
No. She's my Green Bay colleague over here. Okay. The last royal governor of North Carolina was Josiah Martin. His residence was at Tryon Palace in Newbern, which was the colonial capital. And that's where the General Assembly met. But starting in 1774, independent of the officially recognized General Assembly, Whigs, or American Patriots, held a provincial Congress, the Provincial Congress in North Carolina. And of course, Martin was absolutely livid over members of the Provincial Congress, who were members also of the General Assembly, not all of them, meeting independent to talk about their concerns that North Carolina had with the British government. So this was a shadow government that he banned, and they ignored him. So the relationship between Martin and the North Carolinians, which was never as good as it had been between William Tryon, North Carolinians actually respected him. Tryon had even tried to mitigate the Stamp Act resistance by saying, look, if you people will work with me, I'm the representative of the Crown in North Carolina, I am duty bound to enforce the Stamp Act. But if y'all will work with me, I will personally defray some of the cost of the Stamp Act. And what he did is he invited some of the ringleaders of the movement into his residence down at Brunswicktown and got them drunk. We'll drink about this, right? We'll toast Great Britain and look, but they wouldn't accept it. So he left and went to New York. Governor Martin became the governor in 1771, and he would be the last royal governor. So things deteriorated with Martin, so that by late May of 1775, things had gotten so bad, and the Whigs in Newbern had become so aggressive that Martin feared for his own life and that of his family. So he sent his wife, Elizabeth, and their children to New York, which was British controlled. His wife was highly pregnant at the time, as opposed to lowly pregnant, I guess. But he sent them to safety to British controlled New York. But rather than lose control of his lost colony, see how I worked that in, lost colony, North Carolina? He sailed southward from Newbern to the mouth of the Cape Fear River to British Fort Johnston. There were 3 British forts in North Carolina in 1775, but only one of them was garrisoned and serviceable, and that was Fort Johnston at what is today Southport. Okay. So there he took up residence, and then he schemed on how he could regain control of his lost colony. Now, the Patriots learned that he was there and kept close tabs on him. One way that they did it was that merchants continued to supply the crewmen and officers on board a British sloop of war called the Cruiser at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. That was its duty station. And Martin eventually took asylum on board the Cruiser, and merchants continued to send meat and bread. And so they had ears on board the ship and listened very closely to what Martin's plans were, and then of course informed the growing committee of safety that every community had, every county had, every military district had, in every single colony. And this is basically local governments that are taking over from the British government. So slowly but surely they learned that what Martin wanted to do was to launch a southern campaign starting in North Carolina. And the idea was that he would appeal to people who were still loyal to the Crown in North Carolina. And most of them were Highland Scots who had been immigrating to North Carolina since the 1730s, maybe as early as 1730. Remember, the first enduring settlement on the Cape Fear River was not Wilmington, it was Brunswicktown. And they were coming in and making landfall at Brunswicktown and eventually Wilmington, and then going up the Cape Fear River to settle places like Cross Creek and Campbellton and Argyle and Lancaster. And all that's part of the Outlander series, if y'all have been watching that. And while I'm talking about the Highland Scots, and there were about 12 to 15,000 Highland Scots living in southeastern North Carolina in 1775. That was the largest ethnic minority in North Carolina. And the leading authority on that is standing right there. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Sherman. She was my graduate student and teaching assistant, and her PhD dissertation was on the very subject that I'm talking about. I should turn it over to her because she's much better than I am with regards to that. She's much prettier than I am too. Well, don't shake your head yes. I mean, I just admitted it. Facts are facts, right. Why would the Scots remain loyal to Great Britain? Because remember, they had been defeated at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. They were treated horribly by the British government, right?
For hundreds of years.
Right. Well, they left Scotland for opportunities in America. And that's what America was seen as, a land of hope and opportunity. They wanted to escape government, not be a part of it, but to escape it. But to come to America, they had to take an oath of allegiance to the crown or to the king. So they were duty bound by their oath, which was an oath of honor to the British government. In doing so, they got head rights of land, so they could build considerable plantations in America. But the other reason they remained loyal, and think about this, in 1775, on paper, how's this war going to go? Who's going to win this war on paper, right? Great Britain, hands down. So do the Scots want to be on the losing side again? And what the Patriots or the Whigs did really surprised me writing this book on Moore's Creek, is you would think, okay, well, you voluntarily choose to be a Whig or an American Patriot, or you voluntarily choose to be a Loyalist, right? That's the way we've always thought about it. That wasn't the case at all. The Whigs would go to people, they might be merchants, say in Wilmington or at Brunswicktown, and they'd say, you know, we're trying to build support for the American movement, and we want you to sign a test oath of allegiance to the American cause. And if you don't, by the way, I don't know, we might just boycott your business. We'll come back and see you in a few days. Then they'd come back and say, well, you haven't signed the test oath of allegiance to the American cause yet. So we're going to confiscate your supplies. And we'll come back and see you in a few days. You go back, you still haven't signed the oath of allegiance. So you know what? We're going to seize your farm and your livestock and other possessions. In other words, they were using thuggery activities to convince people who otherwise would have remained loyal to the crown to join the American cause. So it's almost impossible for Dr. Sherman to quantify Loyalist activity. I'll give you a perfect example. My dad was in the 7th Armored Division during World War II. And at war's end, in the late spring of 1945, the United States Army kept my dad in Germany because my dad spoke fluent German. He'd taken German at New Hanover High School, German at the Virginia Military Institute, and then he got to Germany and fought in the war, and the war's over. He speaks fluent German. He later said, stupid, stupid, stupid. Why didn't I take Spanish or French? They kept him in Germany until 1946. Working with what we would call refugees. They called them DPs in those days, displaced persons. And my dad said there were no Nazis in Germany in 1945 and 1946. They were everywhere in the 1930s, but try and find one in the late 1940s. There were none. No one professed to being a Nazi, right? And the same thing was true here. When the American cause was won, no one professed to being a Loyalist. Oh no, I was an American Whig the entire time. And that was not always the case. But they would use different tactics to convince people to support the American cause. Okay, so what the Americans have learned is that Martin wants to launch a Southern campaign by taking Loyalists and appealing mostly to the Highland Scots in the Upper Cape Fear River Valley, have them organize, march down to Brunswicktown, where hopefully they would meet an incoming army of thousands of British regular army forces. British regulars, these are the finest fighting forces in the world at the time, just like the United States Army forces are the finest in the world, hands down. The British were the finest. So what Martin did was constantly write letters to the British government, send me men, send me military supplies and equipment and arms, surplus arms that I can supply the Loyalists with. And what I want to do is invade North Carolina by way of the Cape Fear River, which was navigable all the way to Cross Creek, modern Fayetteville. And then I'm going to fan out and I'm going to retake control of the colony. And after we've done that, this massive army, then we'll invade South Carolina. And then we can move into Virginia. And we will threaten all of the colonies south of Pennsylvania. So this was an ambitious, bold Southern campaign proposed by Josiah Martin in 1776. Now, other Southern governors had made similar proposals, like William Campbell in South Carolina and Lord Dunmore in Virginia. But the Crown went with Josiah Martin's plan. So an invasion of the South beginning at the Cape Fear River. Now you start to understand why Moore's Creek happened. Okay, so let's go on. Anybody, any questions? Okay, good. Let's go on. Yes. Oh, thanks. I want you to imagine how long it took for correspondents to reach their destination. I mean, we have it so simple today, we just phone or text or tweet or twat. I wish Trump would quit tweeting so much. But it was going to take months for correspondence to reach London and then to be reviewed and an official response sent back to America. So logistically speaking, all of this stuff was going to take a lot longer to unfold. And how do you work out the timing? Timing was so important. The idea was for Josiah Martin, he sent out word in early January of 1776. He printed a proclamation, big mistake, but he printed a proclamation and sent it by emissaries up the Cape Fear River to be distributed among all of the Highland Scots. Anyone who would muster, organize, and join the army would, if the campaign proved successful, they had to be successful, would be given 200 additional acres of land to what they already had. And they would have arrears on quit rents for 20 years. In other words, no taxes for 20 years. Now those are pretty enticing things that people are thinking about. If I'm going to be given 200 acres of land and tax freedom for 20 years, I'm thinking long and hard about being a member of the Loyalist army that's going to join Josiah Martin. And that was approved of by the King of England, by King George III. Now, he wanted the army, and he figured he could get at least 3,000 Highland Scots. He even boasted at one point, I could get 30,000, but 1/10 that amount would be good enough. They would march, they would muster, organize, and then march from Cross Creek down the Cape Fear River to Brunswick Town. Remember, Wilmington was not the leading city, it was Brunswick Town. There they would meet the incoming force of British regulars. If the timing worked out well, it would be mid-February. So the proclamation went out. Well, guess what? The Patriots intercepted it. In effect, they had Josiah Martin's game plan. So they would muster and organize Whig Patriot forces throughout southeastern North Carolina. Like in Wilmington, there were 150 Minutemen led by Alexander Lillington, Harnett County. In fact, we're standing in his entrenched encampment now. There would be troops from throughout Craven County and Onslow County. Remember, Pender County, where we are now, was then a part of New Hanover County. It's a much larger county, not split up until after the Civil War. but from all Bladen County and Brunswick County. How many? Well, we believe that there were less than 1,000 Americans who were actually here at the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. American Whigs, because let's qualify this. We're talking about American Whigs versus American Loyalists, right? So think of it as a Civil War battle, because that's what it was. You had families and neighbors who were fighting against each other. In some cases, you've got guys who were fighting against themselves. Give you a perfect example. There was a guy named Farquhar Campbell, for whom Campbelltown was made. He lived up in Bladen County, moved over to Cross Creek, and it was his house where Governor Martin, when he fled Newbern, he went west by carriage all the way out to Cross Creek. He stayed with Farquhar Campbell. He confided in Farquhar Campbell. Farquhar Campbell was at the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge for the Loyalists. He was also a delegate from Cumberland County in Halifax, North Carolina, 6 weeks after the battle, and voted for the Halifax resolves until the other delegates found out that he had been a Loyalist at Morris Creek, and now he's a Patriot. So you had some people who were fighting against themselves. They were blowing with the wind. Go with the leading side. So there was a Civil War battle amongst North Carolinians and in some cases amongst individuals. So they were supposed to be at Brunswick Town by February the 15th. The Americans now have mustered and organized their own forces. Alexander Lillington was the commander of the military district that included New Hanover, Brunswick counties. Richard Caswell, who would go on to be the first state governor. Did y'all know that? Fort Caswell on Oak Island was named for him. Richard Caswell formed an army from guys out of Craven County, Dobbs County, Lenoir County, and they marched in this direction. Many thousands, we now believe, 3,000 or 4,000 guys were actually en route to Morris Creek, but the battle was fought before they arrived. And so there were about 950 American Patriots who were here to fight the battle. It was sort of a cat and mouse game, because by the time that the Loyalist army left Cross Creek, a continental force of North Carolinians led by Colonel James Moore had moved up the south side of the Cape Fear River. And he entrenched himself at a place called Rockfish Creek, sort of blocking the path. So the most direct line from Cross Creek to Brunswick Town would be down the south side of the Cape Fear River, right? And the leader of the Loyalists, whose name was Donald MacDonald, not Ronald McDonald, Donald MacDonald, General Donald MacDonald, who was a major in the British Army who had been sent to North Carolina to recruit Loyalists for the main British Army back up in New England. But while he was here, Governor Martin, who was also recruiting Loyalists for his own army, found out that MacDonald was in the area, and so he offered him commission as a brigadier general. Hey, look, I know you're a major in the army, I'll make you a brigadier general. And okay, sounds good to me. So he's got a dual commission and he's being paid double the money. So he's the commander of the Loyalists. He starts down the south side of the river, the way is blocked. So he retraced his steps, crossed the northeast Cape, or crossed the Cape Fear River and came down the north side. And so Colonel Moore figured this out. He sent out word to Alexander Lillington and Richard Caswell, find these people and stop them, intercept them before they can get to Brunswick Town. And one place they're probably going to have to cross is Morris Creek. Morris Creek feeds into the Black River. The Black River is a major tributary of the Cape Fear River. And the only way across Morris Creek was a bridge very close to where we're standing now. This creek was named for Widow Elizabeth Moore, who died in the 1750s. But the bridge and the creek still bore her name in 1776. So Elizabeth Moore. And it was here that on February 26, Alexander Lillington, who was closest to Wilmington, made an entrenched encampment. The earthworks that you see here now were restored in the 1930s, but this is where he stayed. and Richard Caswell would join him on the night of February the 26th. Now, they're trying to figure out where the Loyalists are. The Loyalist army is trying to keep its movement secret, but eventually they show up here, and then they would clash before dawn on February the 27th. All right, let's go across the bridge, the newer bridge, into the Loyalist encampment and talk a little bit about the Loyalists, and then we'll come back around.
The Loyalists lose their land once?
Some of it was confiscated.
By the Patriots?
By the Patriots, yeah. And then they had to use the courts to get it back. Well, thanks for so many of y'all sticking with me. I can be a little wordy. Once I get so excited about this stuff that once I start talking, I just don't quit. All right, let me clear something up because a gentleman asked me about this. There's a Rockfish Creek up near Wallace, but the Rockfish Creek I'm talking about is in Cumberland County that feeds into the Cape Fear River. So when Donald McDonald tried to go down the south side of the Cape Fear River, again, in a direct line to Brunswicktown, that'd be the shortest route, and he found the route blocked by Colonel Moore's, what we would call continental forces. They were provincial forces in those days. They later would become the North Carolina Continental Line. Then he retraced his steps and crossed over the Cape Fear River and then came down the north side. Again, trying to keep his movement secret. Now, another gentleman over here asked about Colonel Moore and Alexander Lillington and Richard Caswell being slave owners, and they were. Most of the principals on both sides were slave owners. And we find this, of course, very hypocritical that the Americans were fighting for liberty and freedom and independence. And literally, Thomas Jefferson, one of the things that he wrote for the Declaration of Independence is how Americans were enslaved to the British government. And Southern delegates said, nah, we better take that part out. So that's one of the passages that never got put into the Declaration of Independence, because we were fighting for liberty and freedom from Great Britain while at the same time enslaving African Americans. Now, that said, African Americans were here. African Americans did fight on both sides. Until 1793, African Americans could actually serve in militia units. Remember, there's no United States Army in the days that we're talking about. But many of them figured that if they fought for, whichever side they were fighting for, that might lead to freedom and independence for them, that they would gain their freedom. There must be some kind of reward for their services, say, to the Whig cause at war's end. Remember the Patriot, the African-American soldier, who was the target of a lot of racial abuse throughout the movie, until right at the very end, the one guy who'd been picking on him at the most. And they're standing in the line of battle at what's supposed to be Cowpens, and Cornwallis's army is attacking, and the racist turns to the black guy and he says, well, your day is up. You only had to serve 1 year. Now you're a free man. You don't have to be here. And the guy said, I'm here today on my own accord. In other words, I'm every bit as good a man as you are. And the racist said to him, I'm proud to be by your side. When the bullets start flying, there is no color, right? We're fighting for each other. So African Americans did serve in the armies on both sides here. Unfortunately, it did not lead to a general emancipation for African Americans in the post-war years. Okay, so this is to be the launching of the Southern Campaign. The Americans arrive late on February the 26th. Alexander Lillington builds its entrenched encampment on the east side. The bridge was in the area where the rebuilt bridge is. It's been rebuilt a number of times, including after Florence. This place was totally underwater after Hurricane Florence. So the original ground is probably 3 or 4 feet below us after 244 years. A lot of sediments built up.
I'm a park ranger here, I apologize.
we're about to do this, so I'm gonna have to get you guys to go back across the causeway.
What are you about to do?
About to do the battle demonstration.
Oh,
So
okay.
I need y'all to either back that way, go around and come back up here. We're about to do it in less.
This is unique. Stand over there with George. Come on up here.
Thank you.
Get your finger out of your nose.
I'm good with that. I mean, he wants I know.
The Loyalists tried to assault and capture the earthworks 3 times, but in the end the Patriots had it.
Well, now that y'all have seen the battle demonstration, there's nothing else for me to say. You know what happens. So thanks for coming along. We'll see y'all later.
We'll hear it in your words.
Okay. So Donald McDonald was not able to get 3,000 much.
Donald McLeod. Is it Donald McLeod or Donald McDonald?
Donald McDonald.
Okay.
Donald McLeod was second in command.
Okay.
Yeah. So you got General Donald McDonald and Lieutenant Colonel Donald McLeod. And the reason that McDonald and McLeod are in North Carolina, the largest Scottish clans in the colony were McDonald's and McLeod's. So when the army tried to recruit Scots throughout all of the colonies, but in the South particularly, they sent Donald McDonald and Donald McLeod in the summer of 1775 to recruit for the main army back in Boston. And as I said, they're recruiting Highland Scots for the Highland Immigrant Regiment. But the plan was once they got them, they were going to go by sea back up to Boston. And of course, Josiah Martin is trying to raise an army of Loyalists too, and he's competing against McDonald and McLeod. So he offers a commission, as I said, to McDonald, make you a brigadier general, and by the way, McLeod, I'll make you a lieutenant colonel if you recruit and fight for me. But they were only able to get about 1,600 Loyalists together in the Cross Creek area. And about a third of them were not armed at all. They might have had those big giant claymores or broadswords that were popularized in the movie Braveheart, remember those things? Or they might have dirks, which were little side knives. And I was out here one year watching a Loyalist reenactor talk about the weapons that they were carrying, and he mentioned a dirk. And out of the mouths of babes, a little boy said, "Why do they call it a dirk?" I got no idea. I don't know why they called them dirks. Little side knives. But the idea was that the British Army would bring in additional Brown Bess muskets to arm the Loyalists. Well, when the Loyalists mustered, and again, about 1,600 of them, they thought they were going to serve as guides to the British Army. They didn't know that they might turn out to be combatants. So as they started marching toward Brunswicktown in that chaotic, confusing march, they learned that they might just end up fighting. And for those who'd had no firearms at all, like, wait a minute, how can I fight without a firearm? So the army kind of melted away. So by the time they arrived at or down at Moore's Creek, there might have been 300 Loyalists at the battle site. So what had been an army of 1,600, by the time they got to the area of Moore's Creek, I think were probably 1,000 or maybe less, and the guys who actually got to the battle site numbered in the hundreds. But they're marching southeasterly. Caswell and Lillington are here. But Caswell, when he joined Lillington, came over to this side of the creek to build an entrenched encampment. Now wait a minute. If the bridge is there and the Loyalists have got to cross the bridge to get on the east side, why would you build an encampment over here? And I've thought a lot about this as I'm writing the book on Moore's Creek. If you look at Moore's Creek from a bird's eye or a drone's eye view today, it runs parallel to the Black River. So I think that the Whigs or the Patriots didn't know which side of the bridge they were going to attack on. So Caswell's got his men over here, Lillington's got his entrenched encampment over there, and then about midnight, a Loyalist courier mounted on horseback named James Hepburn shows up in Caswell's camp on this side. And he's there ostensibly to offer pardon to all of the Americans who would stop this madness. Reassert your loyalty to King George III, lay down your muskets, go home, and you will be pardoned by the king. But what he's really doing is trying to figure out the location of the Americans' encampments. Where are they? And he's counting numbers. So as soon as he leaves camp, and Caswell, of course, says, no, we've come this far, we're not going back. So with my compliments to General McDonald, we reject his offer. So Hepburn rides back to the encampment about 6 miles away from here and informs McDonald, who by then is ill. He's on his sick bed. So Lieutenant Colonel Donald McLeod steps forward to be the commander, and they hold a war council, and Hepburn has informed them where Caswell's camp is. So we'll attack the camp before sunrise. Well, Caswell figures it out, and he moves to the east side of Moore's Creek to join Alexander Lillington. But he leaves his campfires burning, so that when the Loyalists approach, and it takes them a long time to get here, they don't arrive until just before dawn, they attack the camp. They rush into the camp thinking they're going to catch the Patriots sleeping, but they've abandoned the camp and gone to the other side. And so then it's like, fan out, we've got them on the run. They've abandoned their camp hastily, they've got the campfire still burning, so they're on the run. Find them, we'll chase them down. And in doing so, they discovered the bridge. Now keep in mind, it's still dark. Most historians of the battle say the attack occurred about dawn. I don't believe that. I think it was still dark when the battle occurred. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But they found the bridge. In retreating across the bridge, the Americans had pulled up the planks and greased the pine stringers or the girders with animal fat called tallow and soft soap, so that getting across the bridge was going to be very difficult. Now, most historians say they had set an ambush. Well, if you're trying to ambush someone, why would you impede their progress as much as you could by removing the planks? So I don't think that was the case. I think they were going to try to make it as difficult as possible for the guys to get across. So how are they going to get across? It's not even sunlight yet. The girders are slippery. So how are you going to get across? Well, up steps Captain John Campbell. He's got about 75 guys with him, kilted, and they've got those big giant broadswords. So they step forward and they use the broadswords to cross the bridge. They jab the point of the broadswords into the girders and then just gingerly, one step at a time, make their way across the bridge. So it's going to take them a while to get over. McLeod borrows a broadsword. He gets to the other side, and when he's got probably 30 or 40 guys on the other side of the bridge, now remember, they think they've got the Whigs on the run, right? So if they chase them, if they can run them down, they might be able to just disperse them, beat them in a battle and disperse them, and then the way down to Brunswick town would be open. So they get to the other side, about 40 of them, and McLeod, with broadsword in hand, "Follow me, men," and they rush up the causeway, which we're going to go up in just a few minutes, and they rush into something that they do not expect whatsoever. Now, again, only about 300 guys, I think, are here, but most of them are still on this side waiting to get across. Okay, so keep that in mind. Anybody have any questions, comments, observations,
Is there any record of
hallucinations?
how many actually had military experience of the Highlanders?
Well, a lot of people will say, well, this was a British army, right? No, this was militia. These were citizen soldiers that would be the predecessor to the State Guard, that would be the predecessor to the National Guard. The National Guard today are professional men and women. They're professional combatants. I mean, we deploy them to combat zones today. But in those days, we all would have been required to serve in a militia unit. There was no United States Army. There were very few British forces in America to provide homeland security. And where they were resented. Like in Boston, about all the problems that the Americans had with the British soldiers in Boston. So we provided our own homeland security, black and white. But all men were required to serve in the militia. We mustered once a month to train, to fire our muskets, target practice. But it was also not just a paramilitary gathering, it would have been social too. So we're drinking grog at the same time that we're doing all of that. But these guys were not professional soldiers. Now, they, as the war came on, they did train more often. But it was basically what we would today call turkey shoots, and that was about it. But very few, and we don't know all of the stories, unfortunately. Most of them have been lost. But most of these guys had no military experience did. Donald MacDonald did. He'd actually served in the British Marines for 30 years. And then he came out of retirement and they gave him a commission as a major in the British Army. Donald MacLeod was in the 47th Regiment of British Regulars. But other than that, these were not experienced combatants. They're just people like us.
So the main part of
have artillery?
Well, I'm sorry, she had a question.
It seems odd to me that if only like 30 of them were killed, why they didn't keep coming in waves to attack the Patriots?
It's a great question.
Because they're so slow in loading their muskets.
I know, one at a time. And save that question until we get to the other side of the bridge, because I want to get y'all's comments, because what I'm deciding, at least what I'm concluding, runs counter to what other historians have said about the battle. I simply don't believe it. But let's save that till we get to the other side. It's a great question. Thank you.
So most of the fighting actually did not take place on the bridge. It was in front of the bridge.
In front of the bridge.
Okay.
Now, there are accounts that soldiers who were on the bridge, on the girders, there's no bridge.
Right.
Right. On the girders, some of them got shot
and fell into the creek.
and fell into the creek.
Did the Loyalists have artillery?
They did, but not at the battle. It was back in camp. And how many pieces of artillery the Americans had, the Whigs had, is a point of debate too. At least 2 pieces. One piece called Mother Covington. Who the heck is Mother Covington?
That's what I was going to ask.
No, does anybody know who the heck is Mother Covington? And Mother Covington's daughter, right? But by some accounts, there may have been as many as 4 pieces of artillery. We don't know. But keep in mind that number one, there were very few men, and there would have been some women here too. Because with every army, whether it was British or militia, there would have been women to supply support as nurses, caregivers, cooks, laundresses, and in some cases, remember, Molly pitchers. They actually fought in some battles. So there would have been some women here too, but we don't know how many. But if you've got, say, 950 Whigs with Lillington and Caswell, and you've got about 300 Loyalists. So you've got, what, 12, maybe 1,300 people in the area for the battle. The battle lasted 180 seconds. It's the shortest battle in American history with the biggest impact. But what are the chances that of those 12 or 1,300 people who were here, that they would write down an account of what happened in 3 minutes? So it's not like it's Yorktown or Saratoga, it's Morris Creek. Then, if they did write an account, what are the chances that that survived for 244 years? So that's made it very, very difficult for historians like me and Dr. Sherman to find what really happened. And what we're depending on in large part are pension records. But the government did not provide pensions to Revolutionary War soldiers until 1832. Now, how many of the Revolutionary War soldiers were still alive in 1832?
Very few.
The government intentionally delayed paying the Revolutionary War veterans. You know how the Veterans Administration can be today, all the complaints against services. The government was the same back then. They delayed offering pensions to Revolutionary War soldiers as long as they could so that they wouldn't have to pay so many because they were dead. So the government was just the same then as it is today. Does that sound cynical?
How many could actually recall the battle?
Right. In writing their testimonies and applying for their pensions, and by the way, they had to have affidavits from other soldiers who served with them, and they had to prove that they were here. How are you going to prove that you were here in a battle that happened, what, 70 years before? So unless you were a teenager in your early 20s, chances were that you weren't around to get a pension. And then you had to recall stuff that happened almost 70 years before. I can barely remember what happened to me in the 60s. I was there. Do you know what they say? If you were there, you don't remember. That's right. So this was a real problem. And the point is that you have to go through each pension record and try to pull out little nuggets of information. And I found some really good stuff. There was one American Patriot who got into a hand-to-hand fight with a Loyalist and bit his ear off. I don't know why I found that, significant, but there was just very little stuff like that. Okay, yes, sir.
Okay, if the Loyalists assume that the Patriots are on the run, okay, because of the empty camp, they get to the bridge and there's 2 sentries. Wouldn't they think that there's something up?
That's a great question. When they got to the bridge, the vanguard of the Loyalists who found the bridge, they noticed 2 shadowy figures on the other side. Who are those guys? And they called out to him, first in English, and got no response. And then they called out to him in Gaelic. I thought it was Gaelic, but I was corrected by one of my Scottish exchange students who started laughing. It's not Gaelic, it's Gaelic. Asking for identification. Are you a friend? Who are you a friend to? And they got no answer. And they shot at him. Apparently did not hit him, and the shadowy figures just kind of melted away into the darkness. Now remember, most historians said it's dawn, but these shadowy figures sort of melt into the darkness. And that's when they thought, okay, those guys are a part of the rear guard. They're protecting the rear of the main army that is retreating probably toward Wilmington or Brunswicktown. So their presence tells us they're close by. So let's get across the bridge as quickly as we can with as many men as we possibly can and pursue them as quickly as we can, and we can overtake them. And then we can defeat them, and then the way will be open to Brunswicktown. So that's what they're thinking. I'm thinking. Despite what my students thought, I was not here in 1776. Okay, well, let's walk across the bridge and get up there, and we'll talk about your question, because it's a great one.
I played pro for about 5 years. I got picked up by the Patriot. My brother-in-law.
Morris Creek is very narrow, but it's very deep. So it's unfordable. You had to get across Morris Creek by the bridge. The road up to the high ground, which we just walked across, as you can see, is just a causeway and would have been a corduroy road in those days. So to build up a road through that, through the cypress swamps, they would have cut pine or cut links of cypress, which is like steel almost, and laid them crossways, and then filled in around them with brick or ballast stone, other logs, so that they built up a roadbed. And because of the ribbing of the trees, they called it corduroy roads. Pretty smart. And so that's what they're coming across, is that narrow causeway. We don't know exactly what the ground looked like in those days, but if they'd had rain, it would have not looked unlike it does right now. This site is prone to flooding when we got heavy rains because Morris Creek is so narrow, and of course it flows into the Black River. So McLeod has gotten, say, 30 or 40 guys to the east side of the bridge. There are 250 guys still on the west side waiting their turn to get across the bridge. So my question is, why would McLeod, with that small number, rush along the causeway into the teeth of the Whig defenses if he could see them? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if it's after sunrise, as most historians claim, that was a suicide mission. That was sheer stupidity. If you got that small a number of force to attack an entrenched position where there are 950 men and artillery. So I think it was still in the pre-dawn hours when the attack came. I think McLeod figured, you know what, I've got 30 or 40 guys with me. We're gonna rush on up the causeway. We've already been told that there are 2 guys, probably part of the rear guard. We can overtake these guys. So I think they rushed along the causeway and they got to about where we are right now. And then they heard men standing up. They heard the clanking of canteens. They heard officers barking orders, make ready to fire. They heard the cocking of muskets. And you can imagine what they must have thought. Oh no. They had, I believe, and correct me if y'all think I'm wrong, I don't think they had any idea they were there until suddenly there is a sheet of flames of fire from the artillery and from the rifle muskets. And the first guy hit and killed was Donald McLeod. And they later autopsied his body. He had 20 shots in him. Now explain to me why he would attack if they could see him. Okay, so I'm asking y'all, do you think my theory is sound?
It makes sense.
Does that make more sense?
It does.
Right?
What was the weather like? Was it a cloudy time or?
Well, we don't know. It's February, likely cold. There's some accounts that said that there was a mist over the battlefield, so that might have obstructed their view. But again, I think it would have been crazy for them to attack in broad daylight with that many men and so few on this side.
Well, even so, dawn is subjective. Even so, dawn is subjective. A lot of people consider dawn an hour before the actual sunrise, 2 hours.
Yeah, at that time, I think I figured out that dawn was about 6 a.m.
So they probably got here by 5.
I think it's probably 5:30-ish when they made the crossing.
Because, I mean, even at that type of dusk, you could be, like this guy's gray jacket, you wouldn't see him until you're almost on it.
Yeah. Yeah, but looking up there, I mean, if it was after dawn, you would have seen the earthworks, you would have seen the men behind the earthworks, and you would have seen the artillery. So I don't think that can be seen.
I'm just thinking about when I leave for work. I have to work at 7. I leave at 6. Sun's up at 7. I'm not seeing much until 6:30 or 6. You know. So.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the Americans fired several volleys, killing and wounding somewhere between 30 and 40 men, including guys who were on the bridge that might have been hit and fell off, or just fell off because bullets are whizzing their way. And then they panic. The guys on the other side, they panic and they take off running. The Americans, now emboldened, jump over their earthworks and wade into the survivors of the Loyalists and capture a number of them. There's some hand-to-hand fighting, but the whole thing is over very, very quickly. By most accounts, it's just a matter of a few minutes. Colonel Moore, remember, who had blocked the path of Donald McDonald going down the south side, arrives about 2 hours after the battle, and he organizes a pursuit of the Loyalists, who he figures are panicked. They're now routed. They've been defeated. They're routed. They're making their way back towards Cross Creek. And sure enough, he captures Donald McDonald, who's still on his sick bed. They capture about 850 men, and most of them are pardoned. They have to give up their firearms or whatever weapons they have with them. They have to take an oath that they will no longer take up arms against the American cause, but the officers are captured and taken prisoner, and some of them remain in jail, including Donald McDonald, for up to 2 years, and would later be exchanged for prisoners of like rank. And McDonald, of course, wanted to be exchanged for a brigadier general, when in fact the Americans said, "You're not a general, you're a major." So anyway, some of them were imprisoned in Halifax, Hillsborough, and as far away as Philadelphia for a long time. This was an American victory, a Whig victory. First battle in North Carolina during the Revolution. It's a Patriot victory. They are greatly emboldened by the victory. That encourages more support for the American cause. That encourages more young men, both black and white, to join the Whig cause and fight against the Loyalists in North Carolina and against any incursions by the British. The British finally do arrive in the Lower Cape Fear, but not until March and into May, because again, think of logistics. The fleet that brings the army over, commanded by Sir Peter Parker, they straggle in over about a 6-week period. And when they arrive at the mouth of the river, they're informed by Josiah Martin, "I'm sorry, but the Loyalists that I anticipated joining you, who would serve at least in large part as guides and scouts for you," because the British Army knew nothing about southeastern North Carolina. Even the garrison at Fort Johnston were provincial troops. They were North Carolinians, Virginians, New Yorkers. They were not regular British forces. So they anticipated they would be joined by this group of men who would lead them into the interior of North Carolina, and now they've been licked. The Loyalists have been licked. Oh, I'll have to remember that expression, use that in the book. The Loyalists licking at Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. So in retaliation, they plundered up and down the Cape Fear River, attacking farms and plantations, taking livestock, burning mills, liberating slaves. But the Southern campaign ends with the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge, and then, as you heard, the British fleet went south to attack Charlestown, South Carolina, and were defeated in June at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. So the 1776 Southern campaign comes to an end, starting with the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. But that's not the most important thing that occurred as a result of Morris Creek Bridge. 6 weeks after the battle, the 4th Provincial Congress of North Carolina, meeting in Halifax, appoints a committee to come up with a set of resolutions in dealing with the British government. It was chaired by Cornelius Harnett. There's an obelisk to Harnett at 4th and Market Streets in downtown Wilmington. He was the leading revolutionary figure in North Carolina. When John Quincy met him in 1773, he described Cornelius Harnett as the Samuel Adams of North Carolina. Samuel Adams was John Adams' cousin, and he was one of the leading revolutionary figures in Massachusetts. I'm talking about the man, not the beer now. Okay. Cornelius Harnett was the Samuel Adams of North Carolina. As chair of this committee, they put together a set of resolutions, and what they decide is to instruct the delegates from North Carolina at the Continental Congress that would meet in Philadelphia in May and into June to vote in favor of independence. North Carolina was the first colony to put that in writing. The Halifax Resolves, April 12, 1776, was the first written statement in support of independence of any of the colonies. Now, other colonies had given verbal support. Massachusetts, Virginia, we're the first to put it in writing. And that's why when you go to the DMV, you can get first in flight or you can get first in freedom, because we were first in freedom. Now, Delaware claims it's the same thing because they were the first to ratify the Constitution. That's 1787. Go back 11 years. We were first in freedom because we voted in favor of independence. And that was a direct result of the Patriot victory here at Morris Creek Bridge.
But that's not what they tell us when we're in Williamsburg.
No, the Virginians have it, they've got it, yeah, right. Well, you know what North Carolinians say? We live in the vale of humility surrounded by two mountains of conceit. So we're just very humble about our role in history, that's all. Yeah, so. Well, those are my stories and I'm sticking to them.